What I'm always trying to do is to bring alive a particular place and time, usually by trying to find a dozen or so people, 8, 10, 12 people, who lived through this era, whose lives connect with each other in some way. And if I can get the right cast of characters, then I can do a book. The First World War is something which has always deeply fascinated me. On the one hand, the boneheaded madness of these generals who, day after day, year after year, sent hundreds of thousands and finally millions of young men to their deaths. How could they keep on doing that? Who were these people? Where did they come from? At the same time, I've long been fascinated by the dissenters, the people who, on both sides of the conflict, spoke out against it and said this is not worth millions of lives. And indeed it wasn't. For various reasons, that movement was more widespread, more explicit and outspoken in Britain than anywhere else. Partly, I think, because there was a strong British tradition of free speech, which wasn't snuffed out completely by the war, although it was certainly partly crushed. Partly also because Britain had not been attacked. Well, trying to assemble a cast of characters was difficult, because I didn't want to do a series of portraits of stupid generals and then a series of portraits of brave dissenters. And of course, nobody fits quite simply into one or the other of those categories either. There's always a mixture of bravery and stupidity, or wisdom and folly in anybody. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out how to do this. And then one day I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article about a woman named Charlotte Despard, who was a very outspoken British pacifist. And in one sentence in passing, the scholar who wrote this article said Mrs. Despard's activities were naturally deeply upsetting to her brother. And it gave his name, Sir John French, whom I recognized as Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front of the British armies. And I thought, wow, okay, that's going to be an interesting relationship to look into. And then I thought a little more and realized divided families, that's how I'm going to tell this story. That, to me, is one of the joys of being a writer, that you can bring to people men and women whom they ought to know about and don't. And it's a special pleasure when, as a foreigner, I can do that in somebody else's country, so to speak. The chain of events from the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke at Sarajevo to the start of the war, there have been hundreds and hundreds of books written about exactly how that unfolded. And there again, I would emphasize, it didn't have to happen. There was nothing about the assassination which made it something worth all the major nations of Europe and eventually of the world going to war over. It was a sort of series of accidental and unforeseen events. Almost always is the case with wars. People they go to war expecting to solve a problem, and instead it creates new and unforeseen problems. And nothing demonstrates that more clearly than the way World War I ended. It sparked the Russian Revolution, which had enormous consequences for Russia, for Eastern Europe, for decades to come. It made almost certain that there was a legacy of resentment and bitterness left behind in Germany, which of course Adolf Hitler very cleverly manipulated to rise to power some years after the war. And it really is almost impossible to imagine the Second World War happening without the First.